welcome to this session, Applying Cultural Competence to Work with Former Members. I'd like to say thank you to Ashley and to Alicia again just for their excellent work. Appreciate all that you've done here, and this is great. You're doing a great job pulling this together, so really appreciate that. Thank you. This is our plan. A few words of background about myself and my experience, my perspective, where I'm coming from on this, and a statement of the need. And then as background to our main point, we'll talk a little bit about what is a culture, what is cultural competence, and then the main point is what is bold there. A cult is a culture, and therefore how do we apply cultural competence to working with members from a cult or a spiritually abusive group? We will see with our time how it goes. I'm going to restart the timer right here. And we'll see how it goes. If I can talk fast enough and you can listen fast enough, we might have room for discussion at the end, or we might have to discuss during the break. So we'll see how the time plays out there. This is me. I'm in the upper right up there. This is in the North Woods of Michigan at a Bill Gothard retreat center. Bill Gothard is the one down in the lower left there. And looking at this picture, it even looks a little bit prophetic that I'm getting as far away from him as I possibly can and eventually escape. Yay. Bill Gothard was a big fish in a small pond, I suppose. He was fairly famous in some circles of evangelical Christianity, and I know from talking offline, several people are familiar with him. If you're not familiar with him, you might be saying, well, who is Bill Gothard? He had a program called IBLP. Back in the 60s, it was IBYC, Institute of Basic Youth Conflict. So a lot of churches hosted big conferences for that. It was a week-long seminar. And then it became IBLP, which was Institute of Basic Life Principles. And the homeschooling program was ATI, Advanced Training Institute. And I was raised in that program. So who is Bill Gothard? Into the turmoil of the 1960s, so some of the same hotbed for Tony Alamo and the rest of these characters, stepped a brave man with his overhead projector and a week-long seminar, 32 hours, to help parents understand their teenagers and teenagers understand their parents. But so much more. He promised to give you a whole new approach to life. Chicago Magazine had a good article a couple of years ago, and I'm borrowing their timeline here. I highlighted a couple of things. The print may be a little too small to read from on the screen there, but I highlighted two items on the timeline. 1984 is when Gothard started the ATI homeschooling program. 2012 is when Recovering Grace posted the stories that resulted in Bill
fired by his board of yes men, handpicked and engineered not to be able to fire him. So that was something of an accomplishment. Recovering Grace was actually started in 2011, and as Ashley mentioned, it's hard to remember all the way back to 2011 in terms of social media, but it was newer and exciting. It was a great way to reach out and connect, and some of us were doing that. We were reaching out and connecting and saying, is there anybody else out there that's going through this? Anybody that understands? Is this a common experience to anyone? And we realized we are at the leading edge of the students that are going to be following behind us. So a couple dozen of us from the different groups that were forming and were out there, a couple dozen of us grouped together and said, let's start this thing, let's call it Recovering Grace. It was a blog, and then also some support groups online to be support for the SGAs that are from Gothard's program. And we have people in that from all over the world. Initially, we were just focused on the teachings. We just wanted to talk about the bad theology and the bad teachings. But the sexual problems, the sexual misdeeds kept being brought to us, and we couldn't not post those. So we collated those and we posted those, and that was in 2011. I just saw the other day Rachel Denhollander, the one that got the ball rolling against Larry Nassar. Her husband was raised in that ATI program, so current events tie in there. He was raised in the same program. In our groups, this is a common question, and you all probably face this question as well. This is probably familiar to you as well. We get this a lot. Can you recommend a counselor in my area who gets it? And the thought for this workshop arose from mulling on that question. What is it that a counselor who gets it gets? What is it about a counselor who gets it? A corollary question is, how do I explain this to my counselor? Do you have anything you can give me that I can take to my counselor so I can explain to them? And of course, in the more extreme cases, even like what we just heard in the last session, obviously, that's where we need the more specific, the specialized training to deal with the cult exit. But there's so many of these groups that are abusive groups, and people come out of them with that so what, that disoriented, what am I supposed to do now? Who can I talk to? Who can understand this? So we have this need. Can you help me find a counselor who gets it? Can you help me explain to my counselor in such a way? Just a simple example. One of the stories that we posted on the Recovering Grace blog, a girl explained a little bit about her experience with changing her hairstyle. And this is not an uncommon situation, especially for the ladies and sometimes for the guys, in leaving the group, stepping out on their own, and then choosing a hairstyle that doesn't look like, because you saw in the picture, there's a certain amount of uniformity in clothing and hairstyle and dress and so on. So as I step out to assert myself and get my own style, how do I explain what that experience means? How do I package that up and translate that to my counselor? And this author describes a moment of looking in the mirror, wondering what the repercussions will be with her family and her friends, and asking this question, why had I listened to the worldly advice of my aunt? How does she package this up? How does she communicate this to her counselor? And how could we help a counselor understand what she's going through? Because you guys know instinctively, you get it. But how does a counselor who hasn't been through that, how do they get it? How do we help them get it? The bad news is that there's a lack of training and awareness in this area. Lodick did a study in 2008, it's posted on the ICSA website, that more than a third of counselors in his survey had worked with current or former members. But there's a lack of training and awareness for this. I submit that a cult is a culture. A cult creates a culture, and stated simply, a cult is a culture. Therefore, the same cultural competence that counselors use in working with any other culture can and should be applied to work with former members of high control, high demand groups. The good news is that using the window of culture allows counselors to leverage the existing skills they already have. This is a tool they already have in their toolbox, so they can use it if they're aware and know to use it here. Excuse me. What is a culture? I have several definitions here. I will not read all of them. The one in the middle there is from the ACA Code of Ethics. Culture is membership in a socially constructed way of living, which incorporates values, beliefs, norms, boundaries, and lifestyles with others who share similar worldviews. Culture is the context in which clients define and interpret values, customs, and gender role expectations. Culture is a powerful force that acts on the client. Culture is the context that we operate in. It shapes the symptoms that they will notice and then bring and discuss to their client, to their counselor, and how they will discuss them, and what they think the problem is, and what kind of solution they are expecting, and so on. Culture is such a powerful context that we exist in. From an anthropological, sociological, and psychological perspective of culture, these are some of the common characteristics or attributes of a culture that people will consider when they are analyzing a culture. Things like, how do you establish trust and credibility in this group of people? What are the socialization patterns? What are their values? The social structure, power and authority, how is it derived? How is it exercised? And how do people respond to those in authority? What are the written rules? And powerfully, what are the unwritten rules? Gender roles, sex and sexuality, always rules for that. How are people punished and rewarded in order to shape the behavior that is desired by the culture? Images, symbols, and myths that are part of the lore of the culture. Who are the heroes and villains? What are the stories that are told? Excuse me. The religion and spirituality. Dress. Is there a uniform style of dress? Is there a view of the past, present, and future? Language and communication is highlighted here, and I would like to emphasize that theme several times this morning because language is such a key feature of culture, and loaded language is such a key feature of any cult. Attitudes, beliefs, view of the group's place in the world, and acquisition of knowledge and skills. Not an exhaustive list, many common attributes. I adapted this list from the booklet from SAMHSA, SAMHSA being the substance abuse folks. They have this excellent treatment protocol, tip 59, it's the treatment improvement protocol for applying cultural competence to drug and alcohol counseling. They make the point that a drug culture is a culture and shares the same characteristics as a culture, and therefore they can apply cultural competence to work with a drug culture. And they use the SU model. It's a mouthful. The SU multidimensional model of cultural competence. They use the SU model to apply that. The same list that we saw applied to a culture, therefore applies, you can look at any drug culture. You can see the same attributes in any drug culture. What we're doing today is taking that same list then and extending it and applying it to the culture of a cult. Again, the language and communication highlighted. I don't know from personal experience. Now, there may be some witnesses in the room that do, but I had to read it secondhand, that in the drug cultures of the 60s and 70s, they would borrow and adapt language. For example, Star Trek language from mainstream culture. So beam me up would refer to getting high. And if you weren't in the culture and didn't know that, you wouldn't know. But inside the culture, that meant something. And they could easily connect by loading the terms. So terms mean one thing over here, but then they're loaded and they mean something else over here. That's a little bit about culture. What is cultural competence? And I am intrigued that competence as a counselor is not necessarily equal to cultural competence. Cultural competence is one more step yet. A counselor who is competent within their own context and their own culture, cultural competence means one more step yet, being able to take the treatment and the conceptualization, the understanding, and applying that to different clients in different cultures and applying in a way that will be effective and meaningful in different contexts. Thankfully, cultural competence is not a trait that you are born with. You either have it or you don't. It's a skill that can be taught and can be learned. The SU model accords well with the literature in emphasizing these three themes: awareness, knowledge, and skills. Awareness both of the counselor's worldview and the client's worldview. And the fact that those two worldviews are together in the same office at the same time, and some of the deep differences that exist between them. Even differences that can be invisible in plain sight due to things like the loaded language. Knowledge, specific knowledge of the culture, and then the skills that grow out of the awareness and the knowledge, and then are applied in a meaningful way to the specific context. This is an adapted version of the SU model for cultural competence. If you had to reduce today's session into one image, this would be the image. Dimension 1 is the cultures. That's the stacks from front to back. So white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, drug culture, and the culture of the cult. And that's the highlighted in yellow in the back there, the stacks of cults. Dimension 3, from floor to ceiling, is the administrative, clinical, and individual therapist level. Excuse me. So the highlighted in yellow is the individual staff level. We are emphasizing that mainly today. We touch on clinical a little bit in the sense of intake and assessment, but we're mostly focused on the individual. So that's what I've highlighted there. And then dimension 2, the elements of competence, that's the vertical columns. That's the awareness, the knowledge, and the skills. The awareness of the existence of the different worldviews, the cultures that exist, then gaining knowledge about the culture, as well as how treatment interacts with that culture, and then the skills, the practical application that grow out of that. We arrive now at the heart of our point. A cult is a culture. And again, the disclaimer on using the word cult, it's an imprecise term. We use it out of convenience. Different people get different images from the word, and we use it out of convenience. What we have in mind are high control, high demand, spiritually abusive, exploitive, hurtful groups. Singer has the 6 conditions of thought reform, Lifton's 8 criteria, Zablocki has a good definition, and Langone, we saw a little bit of his definition and emphasizing the manipulation and the damaging aspects of it. Johnson and Van Vonderen, I blogged through their book, Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, on Recovering Grace. And we have, on Recovering Grace, we have a blog post for each chapter of the book. It's an excellent book, highly, highly recommended. They pick out 4 common themes to spiritually abusive systems, which are, and I think Alicia alluded to these earlier, the power posturing, performance preoccupation, unspoken rules, and lack of balance. What we are doing in this point is synthesizing those concepts with the anthropological and sociological view of culture, and saying that when you have a group of people that are defined by the concepts like Zablocki, Langone, Johnson, Van Vonderen, Lifton, and Singer describe, when you have a group of people shaped by those kind of attributes, you will necessarily have a group of people that share a set of values and beliefs and behaviors and norms. So it lets us use that window of culture to explore a little bit about that group of people and about what they're about. This is instinctively obvious to the people that come into our group, and I think to many SGAs. When we have people new that come into our online groups and are discussing, okay, what am I going through? What is all of this? And we introduce the idea of TCKs, third culture kids. So kids that have been raised as expatriates, military brats, or in some way they're outsider to the culture that looks like their culture. So you would think that the mainstream culture is their culture, but they're actually an outsider to that culture, and they're learning to integrate back into that. This instinctively resonates with them, that yes, that describes something, that puts something into words that I didn't know how to say. I'd like to apply this using a specific example. The example that I'm from, IBLP in ATI, which is the Institute for Basic Life Principles, Advanced Training Institute, the Gothard program. Now, the specific details are unimportant for other scenarios out there. It's the idea, it's the pattern here that matters. But using this as an example, as a way to apply it specifically. As a reminder, Singer's 6 conditions, the social construct, the rewards and punishments to shape the behavior, and the authoritarian structure. Lifton's 8 criteria, and again I'm highlighting the language because language is such a key aspect of a culture, and such a key aspect of the loaded language is such a key aspect of a cult. And there's an evil genius to it, because you can load the language so that the leaders and the people within the group express it, and they know what they're communicating, and they mean this. And then when you go from inside the group and you try to talk outside the group and explain what's being said, the leaders know to hide behind the fact that it's either ambiguous or meaningless, and they just say, oh, I'm sorry you took it to mean that. I'm sorry you were confused and that's how you misinterpreted this, so they can hide behind this. There's a real evil genius to that loaded language aspect. Excuse me. This list one more time. Same list of attributes. All of these same attributes exist for the culture of a cult. And they give a way to explore the shape of the culture that a person has either been raised in or has been shaped in by the years that they have spent inside that cult. The power and authority, the unwritten rules, the roles, the sex and sexuality, and so on. And again, highlighting the language and the communication, the loaded language aspect of this culture. To use some examples from Gothard's literature, if you've ever seen Gothard's literature, a lot of it is hardbound, attractive books. They're heavy books with thick, heavy papers, beautiful watercolor images meant to be attractive and pull in both children and adults. You can see, if I can, right behind here on this part, oh, it doesn't show the mouse. I should have done this earlier, but laser pointer. There's my fancy laser pointer. This book right here is the character sketches, and they bring together Bible stories with animal stories and pictures and facts and a number of different ways of transmitting part of their teachings. The textbook for the 32-hour seminar that's based on 7 universal non-optional principles. So if you understand these 7 principles, you understand how life and the universe works. Here's a diagram of hairstyle. And if you have this shape of face, well, this is the better hairstyle. By better, we mean frames the countenance more godly, more in line with what you would like to have. So this shape goes, this is better. So come to an ICSA conference and get hairstyle advice. Who knew? I'd like to use several examples. We'll use 3 or 4 different examples from the literature to show how they give a shape of both loading the language and helping to create the structure of a culture. You probably can't read the words here, but you can see the diagram, and it's bad enough. This is an older version and then a cleaned up newer version of the chain of command, or the hammer and chisel. In God's hands there is a hammer, and in his other hand there is a chisel. And God is using the hammer to beat on the chisel to beat on the diamond is the teenager, and so the diamond is being shaped into something beautiful here. This is a view of gender roles, of family structure, of power and authority. The power is one way. There's a one-way trip here, and there's no recourse to complain back or to send a message back up. This is all one way. And it says in this paragraph right here, when a teenager reacts against the tools that God brings upon his life, well, there are severe warnings in Scripture for this. So don't fight back against that. They have a question and answer in one place in another one of the booklets, and they ask, what if a wife is a victim of her husband's hostility? They can't even bring themselves to say the word abuse. And they say, well, there is no victim, because Jesus is your example, and just like Jesus went to the cross and gave his life, so there's your example. This is a pretty horrifying implication here. So that's the chain of command and the hammer and chisel. Umbrellas. We like this. Some people are familiar with the umbrella of protection. You've heard of this. We like the umbrellas in this program. These are different places in the literature that have different umbrellas. The umbrella is a metaphor for protection, and just like an umbrella protects you from the rain, and here's where they're loading the language, right here. It's being done right here. The umbrella is your protection. The umbrella of authority is your umbrella of protection. You want to be under the umbrella of protection. You do not want to get out from under the umbrella of protection. If you are out from under the umbrella of protection, you are in line to receive Satan's destruction. You are where Satan will attack you and hurt you. If you are under the umbrella of protection, God will keep you safe from anything that's not for your good. The logic of umbrellas stacked on top of other umbrellas and umbrellas raining down destruction, you're not supposed to ask questions like that. You're just supposed to get under your umbrella and stay there. Some of the loaded terms, though, that you can see coming from that are things like obedience, submission, rebellion, protection, even concepts about God and Satan. Abigail is an Old Testament story widely regarded by all reputable commentators as a good and wise woman. In modern parlance, Abigail had a husband who was an abusive alcoholic. One day, she made an end run around him to save his life because he was about to be murdered by the soon-to-be King David. So she initiated a plan, outsmarted both guys, both the soon-to-be King David and her fool husband, and saved her husband's life. All commentators say she's a good and wise woman, but not in the writings of IBLP. In IBLP thinking, she got out from under her umbrella of protection to do this. And so some of the terminology here, the quotes, that her independent action caused permanent grief. Her effort from saving her husband from being murdered was destined to bring ultimate tragedy and grief. Her methods were wrong and displeasing to the Lord, who hates rebellion against authority. This is where we're loading the language right here. And even though that authority be an unwise father or foolish husband. You may wonder what the permanent grief and the ultimate tragedy are. Through an impressive piece of logical gymnastics, they end up blaming Abigail for David's sin with Bathsheba. You always suspected it was probably a woman's fault, and it's Abigail's fault. So don't be like Abigail. So we're seeing how they're doing, how some of the culture is taking shape here, and the loaded language that they're loading up. Over on the right side, things like protection, destruction, God, the concepts of God and Satan, God being the protection and Satan the one that's going to rain down destruction on you. Rebellion and submission being equated to being under the umbrella or being in your place as the diamond getting wailed away on by the hammer and the chisel. Submission and obedience, authority, and the role of being in submission to authority. The parents not only have a right to be overbearing, they have an obligation. They're on a mission from God to be overbearing in the life of their children. Another phrase that we did not see yet, we'll see in a minute, is mighty in spirit. Bitterness, of course, easily equates to anything that involves telling the truth to the people that don't want to hear the truth from you. And these are just a few, there's many other, but here are some of the examples of the loaded language. And again, part of the genius of this, the evil genius, is that all of these phrases are either innocuous or relatively meaningless in isolation. And so a counselor can be hearing from a client using these phrases or saying these, and if they're just random, disconnected expressions that don't fit into the context, that's part of when the counselor doesn't get it. Part of when the counselor gets it is when they understand how these fit into the context and the meaning that they have. Of course, rules about sex and sexuality. Like the training centers, where they had groups of young people, even the brothers and sisters weren't supposed to be around each other too much, say a quick hi and goodbye, move on. We don't want to look like we have males and females and dating and things like that. A real heavy emphasis on courtship. This was not nearly as isolated as like the Alamo group, but at their training centers they would have groups of like high school and college people living there for years at a time, and a very strict set of rules. Excuse me, a heavy emphasis on modesty, and you saw the style of dress in that picture. You can see pictures from any event and they all look the same. You have to look for landscape clues or for a date to know, because they all have the same style of dress and hairstyle all through. Rules for sex, even inside of marriage. Learning modalities is kind of interesting. It's a homeschool program, and you're not supposed to go to college, so they get to control the information that is available to you, that you use for learning. And then through the different seminars and the workbooks and so on. Their view of their place in the world, they're God's Marines, they're the cutting edge of revival, God is doing a new work. The terminology is going to shift, but the attitude that's familiar to us from any group that we work with is that elitism. That sense of, well, you don't want to be average, you want to be excellent. You know, you're not the normal person, you're the special person for being here. So reflecting then on the culture of the cult, and again, those are specific details from one group. The specific details will change, but the shape will be there. These same aspects will be rounded out in their own way in each different group. The culture of the cult is a powerful force, and it's intentionally set in opposition to mainstream culture. There is a struggle for the person coming out of that culture that is akin to acculturation, akin to anyone acculturating into a culture that is like a foreign culture to them, that they've in some way been an outsider of. They are like TCKs. SGAs are like TCKs. They're like third culture kids trying to integrate back into mainstream culture. They have to juggle between their own culture and the culture that exists in the counseling office. The counseling office has its own culture, and interacting with translating terms and ideas and interacting with the differences between the culture that they were raised in and the culture that exists now. And some of the assumptions, the things that are being taken for granted in both the client's head and the counselor's head. And one of the things that happens is it's just exhausting for a client to sit there and try to explain all of these things if the counselor is not grasping the context and the significance of how these different pieces fit in. It's exhausting to constantly do that translating. And the crazy thing is, if there's one thing that kids, and my perspective is SGA, being raised in it and then working with SGAs from our group. So I'm speaking primarily from that, and I think it translates to, in many ways, to people going in and then coming out. Excuse me, but if there's one thing that those of us that were raised in a system like that are good at, it's stage managing appearances. We can look pretty calm, pretty collected on the outside, and inside it's like a duck's feet paddling underwater, just furiously trying to translate and keep it all together. But even a perceptive counselor would be hard put many times to grasp how furiously those feet are paddling inside, because we're stage managing those appearances. We have a lot of experience doing that. Simply being aware of this cultural struggle will go a long way towards being a counselor who gets it. Just simply being aware of this cultural reality and this cultural struggle. So that's a little bit about how a cult is a culture, the culture of the cult. How do we then apply cultural competence with that in mind? How do we work with former members with that knowledge in mind? Again, the Sioux model names awareness, knowledge, and skills. Awareness, again, the client's worldview and the counselor's worldview. and the deep differences that are between them that are invisible in plain sight, often due to things like loaded language or assumptions that the client doesn't even know to bring to the front and to verbalize, and the counselor wouldn't know they were there otherwise. Knowledge has to do with being willing to gather knowledge. One of the authors said, take the position of an anthropologist. And I paraphrase that as, think like an anthropologist. The good news for that point is that's what we just did. With the culture of IBLP, we just took 15 minutes to think like an anthropologist about what is the culture that these teachings create. And then skills. From assessment on through to treatment, how do we apply that? This graphic is meant to represent the difference between the counselor's worldview and the client's worldview. The image on your left represents the counselor's worldview with things like Bronfenbrenner's ecosystem and Maslow's hierarchy. These things are taken for granted. It's not bad to understand your own personal needs and to advocate for them and to assert that they exist. Over on the right, and I apologize if this particular document is triggering to anybody because it's a bit crass, a bit coarse. This is from a document about, it was teaching young adults how to counsel other young adults with regard to sexual abuse. And they give a diagram here of spirit, soul, and body. Now, it's not an uncommon belief in Christianity that there's some mix of spirit, soul, and body. But in the Gothard program, that's taken to an almost ascetic extreme, where spirit is prioritized and body is deprioritized. This document asks the question, let's see if I can zoom here. This document asks the question, which part of you is the most important? The answer is, of course, it's the spirit. Well, what part did the abuser hurt when they abused you? Well, they hurt the body. But what part do you hurt when you are bitter? This is where we're getting into the loaded language of bitterness and forgiveness and so on. Obviously, you hurt the spirit. And over in a different place here, it says something about what if you had to choose between no physical abuse or being mighty in spirit. It's terrifying to me that they're almost getting you to assent, I think, in some ways, to the abuse. Because if the abuse resulted in being mighty in spirit, one of the loaded terms there. So that's the mindset then that exists in the client's worldview. And they don't know to express this. They don't know how to, and they don't know to put it into words and put it out there. So there's a gap. And what happens, this is meant to represent what happens when the counselor kind of doesn't get it. It's like there's a brick wall, and it's invisible to them. And they don't see it. They don't recognize how deep the difference is between their worldview and the client's worldview is. And the client just takes it for granted, and they don't realize they need to express that and put it into words. But even if they did, they don't know how. So that's part of the thought here, is just recognizing the cultural reality that even though, and not falling for the myth of sameness. The myth of sameness being, you look like me, you have a similar ethnic background, you use the same language, we must be from the same culture, we're the same, I know what you mean, I understand the terms you're using, and then falling for that and not realizing there's a difference between what you mean when you say those terms and what I understand when you say those terms. In this area, in Indiana, we have a lot of Amish people. It's more obvious if a person comes in and they're wearing a certain hat and they have a certain haircut and a certain style of clothes and an accent, a Dutch accent, and they're sitting there talking to you, every sentence reminds you that there's a cultural gap. Every word they say, there's a cultural, a reminder that there's a cultural difference. But what about when the client looks like you, sounds like you, but that exact same cultural difference can still exist? And this is what happens when the counselor is not aware of that. So awareness touches on, so here's our three things: awareness, knowledge, and skills. Awareness touches on knowing the counselor's worldview and the client's worldview and not falling for the myth of sameness. That's what I just touched on there. Awareness of abuse and trauma. By definition, it's an abusive group. Many members coming out, this is probably part of why they're seeking treatment, have trauma related to that. I like the word sequelae to refer to to this situation where it's not just random disconnected experiences that the person is going through. They fit into a context. They are to be expected. There's a constellation, there's a cluster of symptoms and experiences that a counselor ought to be expecting. So if all they've heard is, well, I was raised in a religious group, or I was raised in a legalistic, or a strict, or a conservative religious group, they may not understand, wait a second, I just heard a red flag, and when they begin to flesh out and hear more about the culture and more about the group the person was raised in, they should expect, of course, doesn't everybody have shame, low self-esteem, and anger, some experience with that? But when a person has left a group, the context it fits into, there's so much more meaningful and connection with those experiences for them. Powerlessness. They've probably been shaped to be powerless. It took me a long time to understand, because I like much of what happens in 12-step groups, and I like experiences I've had in 12-step groups. But the emphasis on powerlessness was often frustrating to me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And later when I realized, when you've been shaped and raised to be powerless, this kind of means something different to you than it does maybe to the typical individualistic citizen of the West. Life decisions. It's not surprising that people who have been barred and discouraged from making any decisions at all will have trouble making life decisions. One of the more poignant stories that we had that we posted on the Recovering Grace blog was Ruth's story. Ruth was a secretary to Bill, and one of the moments in Ruth's life later, she married a guy that was a pilot. He was one of the private pilots for Bill that flew him around in one of the airplanes. And he ends up being a really good guy. And they left the program, and he really loved her and cared for her. She eventually died from cancer, way too young. But he really loved her and cared for her. But one of the experiences she had is she passed out in the grocery store trying to make a decision between some insignificant, like 2 different brands or 2 different products. It's a decision that any person would normally just not give that much attention to. But the stress of making so many decisions, and that one hit, and she passed out from the stress of that decision. And understanding that that's not a random, disconnected thing that happened in her life, but that fits into a context. Medical and dental. If you've been raised in a system, or you've been living in a system for many years that deprioritizes the body and the individual, and doesn't encourage you to take care of your own needs, they may not have been receiving medical and dental care. We heard a really extreme example of that. It's very possible that a good dental and medical checkup would be in order for them. And also drug and alcohol information, I'm tossing that in. People that are acculturating into a different culture are already at a higher risk for struggle with alcoholism. And if you have not received information about either alcoholism or moderation, if all you've heard is don't do it, it's bad, and that's pretty much it, then they may be set up for extra struggles with alcohol or other drug use issues. Knowledge. As I say, the good news is here we pretty much already covered this one in the previous point. Think like an anthropologist. If you just ask someone point blank, well, tell me about the culture of the cult that you were raised in, you're probably going to get a blank stare. Point blank question probably results in a blank stare. But gathering information, being willing to do a little bit of research, where can you get information? From the group's own literature. They may have books or audio tapes or videos. They may have blog posts and their own information otherwise available. Information about the group from outsiders. This day and age, there's probably a blog where somebody somewhere is writing about any group of any sufficient size, critiquing it or considering it in some way. There may very well be groups of survivors, people who have left and now are writing about it and talking about it. That's one of the good things of social media today. There's probably a group out there. All right, hi, sign. Five minutes? Okay, thank you. Excuse me. That, by the way, is a good place to stay in touch with for counselors working with clients who've come out of a group. How is your experience in the group of other survivors, other people who have left? Excuse me, are there other questions being asked? Are there issues? Are there themes passing around? It's a good place to stay in touch with. It's a good source of information. And then the skills that grow out of that. Excuse me, I have a number of links and other resources in the slides here, and I can show you those, or you can get those if you're familiar, so we can kind of breeze over these. From assessment on through treatment, a number of the sources recommend that right from the start, assessment should consider spiritual history or religious history in some way. The CFI in the DSM-5, they've moved culture from being kind of a footnote in the appendix on into being more part of the structure and the source of the material. And it has the telescoping nature. It's meant to find the tips of the iceberg, and then where there's something else, let that telescope out and find more information about that. So even just the CFI can flag, hey, there's some religious and spiritual experiences here that are worth looking into. So letting that do its job. CultRecover.com has a specific link with a bunch of links underneath it for assessment tools, and there are other spiritual assessment resources out there. Again, being willing to gather information. Skills is the part where the rubber hits the road. This is the so what. This is the practical part of what does a counselor actually do. It's daunting for a client to ask a counselor, would you be willing to research this group a little bit? Could you gain a little bit of understanding about the group I've come from? But if the counselor only looks at it as one random, disconnected piece of trivia in their life, they're not getting the context. They don't see it. So be willing to gather some information about the particular group that this person has come out of. The explanatory model is fleshed out in several different resources. You know the experience of a patient. If you're talking to a doctor and the doctor thinks that the least important thing in the world is your own perspective on your own situation, it seems revolutionary within the world of medicine to actually listen and let patients explain. And that can be applied as well to a client. Letting them explain what they think the problem is, what they think the origin of it is, what they think makes it better, what they think the meaning is, and so on. Letting them explain. The explanatory model can be a good tool in the toolbox there. The calendar. This is one of the simple exercises to help draw out, so to get around that blank stare. Asking someone, what was a day in the life like? Let's take a Monday. What was a typical Monday like? What was a Tuesday like? Walk me through a Wednesday, and so on. And you start finding out, oh, you got up at 5:30 in the morning, you read the Bible for an hour, you prayed in a certain posture or whatever, getting a sense of what the flow and the shape of the day was. Langone emphasizes social reintegration. He has a number of points in chapter 10 of this one, chapter 10 of the Recovering from Cults book. He's got several points, one of which is social reintegration, which dovetails well with what we're talking about here, coming out of that culture that they've been in and integrating back into mainstream culture. Social service referrals, because if their view of the world is unlike Bronfenbrenner's ecosystem, that, hey, there's the whole ecosystem out here of other places to be involved with, but rather their view is, here's us, the group, not really the individual, just us, and everything else is them, they probably are not aware of the wealth of resources that are available. So simply helping them find and connect with those resources. In all of the literature that I reviewed, group counseling is not contraindicated. Group counseling is indicated with the caveat that you do not want to create another cult in the group. You need to differentiate the group from being the cult. So be careful about that. The Tip 59 book has RESPECT, so I'll put that song in your head for the rest of the day. They have respect. E in that one is explanatory models. There's another one by Kress, I Can Start, and I like this one. The individual counselor, each counselor brings their own strengths, the things that they have to offer to the situation. It's a strength-based focus. So what does the counselor have to benefit in this situation? The context of the client is what we've been talking about. The assessment and diagnosis, right from assessment on through. And then again, I highlighted strengths. Looking for the strengths. These people that are coming out of the cult have so much resilience, and probably more than they're giving themselves credit for. They've done so much, and they've accomplished so much. Drawing out those strengths. And then, okay, so bringing it back home to the hairstyle, and we'll wrap it up here. A counselor who didn't know all the other stuff about what the person's experience was, but learning the shape of the culture, learning what some of the cultural elements are that this person is coming out of, is better equipped now to realize that in terms of spirituality, you're worried about being under the umbrella and out from under the umbrella, about protection and attacks, destruction, about within the social structure, are you going to be pushed aside as one that's less safe and doesn't fit into the group as much anymore. The values and beliefs related to submission and not asserting oneself. The symbols and myths, including even Abigail. Have I done something like Abigail did and asserted myself in a damaging way? Gender roles, and so on. And even just against the mainstream culture. Are people going to like it? Is this hairstyle going to work? All of these things, they're not disconnected. They're connected and they make sense within the context, and they can be looked at through the context of culture. On my final slide after this one, I have a number of links. If you're interested, those links are available just for touching on some of the different areas that we talked about. So to conclude, there is a big lack of training for this subject. Let's try to scroll on the right part here. There's a big lack of training for this subject, but counselors already have the competence that they need for working with many former members. I'm not suggesting this is going to put out the cult exit counselors that are doing the deep, hard work with the more extreme. I'm not suggesting this is going to put them out of business anytime soon. But for many clients, counselors already have the competence that they need for working with them. Simply being aware of the cultural context of this client will go a long way toward being one of the counselors who gets it. A cult is a culture. Therefore, the same cultural competence that counselors use in working with any culture can and should be applied to work with former members of high control, high demand groups. Ashley.